Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1469. Top of 1469. A very fascinating discussion here on the relationship between soul and body, which is serving as an example of relationship between godly energy and existence. Because that's, of course, where he's leading to understand our connection to what drives us. So just like he doesn't bring here, but we learned earlier, Maimer Chazal, where it says, Ma neshama malas haguf, just as a soul fills the body, kacha kodesh baruch hu mamalas ha'elam. So too does God fill existence. So we're talking about mamala kalam, not save of kalam, not the transcendent, but even mamala kalam, like we learned, the air itself is not impacted. The etzema air is not impacted by the recipient, meaning here the body. And that's going to teach us also how it is l'mayla. Ni havaya lo nisi. Even havaya, which is already a gili air. Havaya, not just the etzem, but the air also lo nisi. However, there is a level that does engage. And that's vital as well, because remember, God also wants a relationship with him. Not just one where we are, I don't want to call it a one-way street, but we're affected, but he's not affected. Where there is a relationship and there is an engagement, so that's what's called hislapshus. Elokus ba'elamis, that's the expression, it's like hislapshus, neshama beguf. So the soul enters in the body not in a detached way. There are parts of the soul, what he calls the darga achrena, the lower levels of the soul, we call the bechinas madrega tachtena of the ruchnius, of the neshama, that manifests and engages. And that's where you have the gashmius of the ruchnius, of the nefesh, engaging with the ruchnius of the gashmius of the body. And what is that? So the gashmius of the ruchnius is the koyach, his galus and his pashtus, the power of the soul to express itself and to reveal itself and to manifest and give life to something else. That's a force. As I said, you could have a soul that would be completely self-contained and doesn't give off energy to anything but itself. And then you have, in the body level, you don't just have a physical body, a piece of a klotz, what they call in Yiddish, a klotz holz, a piece of dead wood. The body is made up of different parts that are conducive to receive this energy, and namely, dam hua nefesh. The blood is the primary place where the nefesh resides, and the blood is made that way. Its very chemistry and chemical makeup is such that's refined enough to be called the lifeblood, is called the life energy, the life liquid that gives us life. The blood itself, as we said, is not life, but it's the place where life manifests. So the blood is, like you said, dam or nefesh, the gashmis, the ruchni shebe gashmis. And these two meet in a way where there is an engagement. And that then explains the two things, what he said, Shnei Emes, when he qualified the beginning of the middle paragraph on page 1468, he said, on one hand, we say the nefesh ha'adam mispa'eles memikri aguf, it's impacted, affected by the experiences of the body. So the joy or the pleasure and pain of the body affect the nefesh. That also has pain. And like we learned afterwards, also the other way around. The joy and the pain of the nefesh affects the body in a physical way. On the other hand, we say the nefesh doesn't change. We said, listen, the nefesh doesn't change from the way it was. It remains a spiritual entity. The nefesh never becomes a body. It enters the body, unites with it. So he explained this because there's two dimensions here. There's the part of the nefesh, what he called etzem ruchnius of the nefesh, like the ruchnius sheba ruchnius, that remains intact. But then there's a part of the nefesh that does engage, and as it manifests inside the blood, as it manifests inside the flesh and blood of the human being, to the point where he says misachedes. He had a word that it becomes literally like one, ke'echad. Mamish at the bottom of page 1468. That there's that kesher v'chibra ruchnis begashmi lachad mamish So there, they affect each other. So the physical pain or joy or pleasure will affect the nefesh, and vice versa. Like he brought Shmur Teva to Dashan Etzem, that a piece of good news, happy news that gives you joy, actually can make the bone, the very physical body, expand, and will make the face shine. And the same thing, God forbid, the opposite. Bad news, grief, can cause the opposite, could even cause a person to become ill physically. So you see how spirit and matter engage with each other. They're not just two separate entities entirely, which really fits very well if you think in the scientific context of things, especially when E equals mc squared, where energy and matter in general are just interchangeable. They're just two forms of the same thing. So really very consistent here. But here, the key thing to remember that they are two different worlds, but they come together and they join together. He doesn't discuss here why is that the case, but the fact of the matter is because the root of it all comes from the same God that created both. He doesn't say that. I'm just mentioning it. But the fact of the matter is that there's two tracks, but these two tracks interact in a very intimate way. And therefore, we can understand, like he concludes on top of page 1469, what we learned yesterday, that the soul itself, the nefesh ruach atzmi, should be affected by the pain or the joy of the body, bodily pleasure or pain. However, when the nefesh does, its lower level does manifest inside the person, in the sense inside the blood, the flesh and blood of the person, does have that impact on each other. Yeah. And it goes both directions, yeah. But he qualified, Akla Prokim, there are times where the lev, Yedeya Moras Nafshe, that the pain, the bitterness of the nefesh, the lev will feel. So there are instances where a deeper spiritual thing will affect the body as well. And the same thing, a deeper pleasure that generally would not be affecting the body. There are times that it does, but he doesn't really elaborate on that. That's just a qualification of the Mittler Rebbe on top, the parentheses on line 2 and 3 on page 1469. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain this, Yesh Lekarav, with his own explanation. He's explaining the Mittler Rebbe's words, because all this was we quoted, most of it is from the Mittler Rebbe. I just do want to say one more thing about the issue with the ruchnius shebegashmius of the blood. The reason that I was very insistent on saying that even like we talked about a blood transfusion, blood does carry life, and you see that. You can take blood from one person, and even if you take it out of their body, it can give life to someone else. That means the blood continues to carry energy. I don't want to compare it exactly, but it's almost like, let's say you have an appliance or a faulty wire that is not feeding the proper electricity to a particular appliance. So an electrician can come and rewire it and make sure the electricity that was running through that wire runs through a different wire. So you have the concept that one thing can energize another. You see, the Pasuk says, where it says Damu HaNefesh, the Pasuk says that you're not allowed to eat blood. So you could ask the question, 1 second, Damu HaNefesh is as long as the blood is inside the body. I understand we're not allowed to be vampires to suck blood out of a human body. But once the blood is outside of the body, it no longer is the nefesh. It's now just a dead substance, essentially. And in fact, there will be a point where the blood will not probably be able to give energy to someone else. Like I mentioned, a person, God forbid, dies. They have blood inside them. The blood is not gone. And yet the blood is no longer carrying the nefesh because the nefesh is gone. So the blood is a carrier of the energy, put to the point. Not only it carries, it absorbs it. So we call damu HaNefesh. But the Isser Achilas Dam that he called from the Pasuk where he said, Lo Seichel HaNefesh Ima Basar, is referring to blood outside the body. That too needs to. You're not allowed to drink blood. Period. I know it sounds disgusting, but I'm just saying. He actually says teyevahi. It's an abomination, or it's disgusting, or however you translate it. So you see from that the blood, because the blood is a property, has properties that carries the nefesh, so it's called nefesh, and that's something we don't eat. And there are many explanations why not, but the point being is it's called the dam or nefesh, not just the dam inside the body, but also when it's outside. That's the isser. And that's why there's all the different laws I mentioned, kisui dam, like you see when you make kaparas, and they shecht we see it by kaparas, but it's always when they shecht a chicken or an animal, and the blood runs out, you're supposed to cover it. Why do you have to cover it? It's no longer inside the body. Because dam has that property. I mean, just as an example, Chassidus uses a different example, not for this point, but for a different point, that the brain is not just a piece of flesh where you happen to have which just happens to be able to conceive of ideas. The very physical brain is also structured in a way that's fitting to generate neurons and to and all that on all brain activity. In other words, if you were to take, for example, the very makeup of the heart, or for that matter, the liver or the lungs, and replace the brain with that, it wouldn't have that capacity. So the kelim are very conducive. That's how we learned in the beginning of Ayin Beis. He spoke at length about how the kelim and ears were tailored to each other. Some kelim are not fitting for certain eir. Eir HaChochmah goes into klei HaChochmah. And the same thing, the power koyach HaSeichel goes into the moyach. Koyach HaShmiyah, the power to hear, the ear, the physical ear is structured in a way that's conducive, that allows hearing. Whether it's the nerves, whether it's the cochlear, I mean, all the different elements of an ear. Same thing with the physical eye. It's not you can just take one organ and replace it with another and it's going to do the same function. No, it won't. So machines have to be built accordingly to whatever their function is. Form and function go hand in hand. The blood is in the same idea, that it's made in a way that it is a carrier of life fluid. That's what we call life blood, the blood of life. Okay, and bottom line is that just helps us understand the engagement and the interaction that really, where they join together, what he calls kesher v'chibur, and therefore they impact each other on that lower level. So now we're up to the parentheses on top of page 1469. So that was a summary. I will now continue learning inside. If anybody wants to ask anything, I'm fine with that as well. Before we continue. But okay, good. So line 3 on page 1469, which is, just to lay it out here, is a parenthesis that goes 3, 6, 8 lines. And then right away begins another parenthesis that goes all the way to the end of the paragraph. So these are two parentheses that the Rebbe Rashab, so all his own addition. So it's interesting to see how he's going to explain, and also makes sense. For Yesh L'Karav Zeis, if you didn't know that he was explaining the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, you'd ask yourself, what means Yesh L'Karav Zeis? He's explaining his own idea. But now that we know that the language that we've read till now is Mittler Rebbe's language, from the Maimer Mik Hashem Elokeinu Hamashpili, which is Hamagbi L'Sheves, the Maimer that we've been referring to. And if you want to know exactly, it's page 376 in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So now we have the Rebbe Rashab's addition to explain it. So he says like this, the pages can be found here. The text we're reading, if you want to follow, is in ayinbeis.com, where you have a PDF scanned of all these pages. Okay. And I think all of Ayin Beis is there, at least volume 3 for sure. The Yesh L'Karav Zeis. Now, Yesh L'Karav Zeis literally means we can bring this closer, but usually the full expression is Yesh L'Karav Zeis ala Seichel. Sometimes that's the expression, to explain it more. But Yesh L'Karav Zeis is essentially a short way of saying, well, let's make this easier to understand, or make it explain it more. So it's not it's common, but not that common expression. Yesh l'karav zeis, memasha anu from what we see, the kasher adam hu be'eza tirda. So he's going to give an example, something we all can witness empirically. We see it. When a person is busy, be'eza tirda, with any exertion, tirda is effort, with any effort. Kamay be'tirda sasechel, ukahai gavna. Tirda sasechel means you're exerting your mind to understand something. So we're talking about tirda means there's an exertion involved. It's not coming. It's not just coming automatically, but it's with a tirda sasechel. Hai gavna, just like etc. or similar. So we see when a person is really occupied or consumed, you can say, with that effort, he won't feel a pain that may be existent in one of his limbs. It's like when you're really busy with something, obviously he's not talking about a pain that's overwhelming, that doesn't allow you to concentrate. But when you're really concentrating on something, it's very likely that you may ignore and not feel pain in another part of your body. This is not uncommon. We see this all the time. So he's using this as an example to explain the ideas we're learning. We'll soon see how it works. So he's explaining with this. At the time when the nefesh is so-called transcends, is beyond the slapshus and geshem aguf. Remember, he spoke about the nefesh, not as it manifests into the gashmius of the ruchnius, and the gashmius of ruchnius, which manifests into the ruchnius of gashmius. When it's lamayla mislapshus. So that's the example. It doesn't feel that much the experiences of the body. In other words, when a person is very preoccupied and a deeper spiritual level, doesn't feel the experiences of the body. So you see here a very practical example that there's even a regular human being without any particular high-level spiritual immersion is possible when they're busy with something. There'll be less sensation and distractions. I mean, I can give examples from my own life. I've seen it a number of times. I think I've shared the story with adrenaline. That I remember I had allergies when I was a teenager, late teens, early 20s. And I remember Sundays, because I was so immersed in working in the sichos of the Rebbe, I didn't feel the allergies. So I thought I was so busy, I didn't notice. You're very busy with something, you're not going to notice smaller pains. Again, I'm not talking about a pain that's so overwhelming that doesn't let you do anything, debilitating pain. But regular things, there are things you could be very busy. Then, I discovered that it was also the adrenaline that was flowing, but that's not for here. The point is that he's using this as an example, so you can see there are times where if a person is more involved, nafshizdik, that's the example he's using. The tirda sasechel, so the same thing, the nefesh, so he won't be so affected by the experiences of the body. What comes to mind immediately on an extreme level is the Modzitzer Rebbe story. The Rebbe brought it in Kisisa Tafshin Mem Dalet. So it's a classic story. The Modzitzer Rebbe needed surgery. I think an amputation, something that there was no anesthesia, or maybe he couldn't use the anesthesia. I think there was no anesthesia, but it was going to be a very painful operation. So he told the doctors and those around, he said, let me begin singing a song. He started singing. He says, when you see that I'm like in a different place, transported to a different place in time, type of trance, then perform the surgery. And that's what happened. And he didn't feel it because he was like in a different world. He took himself to another reality. Now that's, of course, a higher level experience. As a matter of fact, I always wondered whether this was a true story or not. So one Pesach, I happened to be in the program, and his grandson, named after him, is literally the son of his son. Taub was his first name. He was named after him, Rabbi Taub. He was a businessman. He was in real estate in Manhattan. And we met, and he told me he's a grandson of the Modzitzer Rebbe. So I asked him the story. So he said, yeah, it's a famous story in our family. And he had credibility because he was a real skeptic. He laughed at everything. So I said, you sure? As a skeptic, said, no, it happened. My father was there. There were people there. We know it was eyewitnesses. I said, he literally didn't feel it? He says he didn't feel it. I said, what about afterwards? He says he doesn't know. But during the time, he did not feel as if there was anesthesia. So it's not surprising, because what's anesthesia at the end of the day? It's also a mysterious ingredient and mysterious properties that is not going to sleep. Because when you're asleep, God forbid, and someone cuts, you're going to wake up. So anesthesia is actually dangerous. It goes on the borderline, not death, obviously, but it's not as simple as just putting someone to sleep and they don't feel pain. As I said, serious surgery is not, you're not going to be able to sleep, God forbid. But so to be able to induce such a state that someone can induce it spiritually. Again, I'm using an extreme example. I don't know if the Rebbe Rashab is going that far. Here he's simply saying that someone's busy, immersed in something, they won't feel a little scratch, for example, that you would usually feel. So that's enough to explain this. I just wanted to bring this in to show you how extreme it could be, just as an example. But the Rebbe Rashab is not necessarily going to this level of the Majid Rebbe type of completely going into that type of trance. Again, it's my own addition. So, but on a very basic level, he's saying that when a person is immersed in something, they won't feel, and he says, kol kach. It doesn't say not feel at all, but not as much, because you're like in a more elevated state. So that's one example he gives. The Yesh L'Karev, this is meant to help us understand what we just learned before the parentheses. So let me just pause here if anybody wants to ask anything, and then we'll continue. He has another thing he wants to add in explaining this. So, but let's stop here for a moment. I think it's pretty clear. It's an interesting example the Rebbe Rashab is giving. Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
In the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in chapter 32, it says the halachas, the 22nd halacha talks about psychosomatic, illness, that the effect of worrying and happiness and worrying and anger, that they shehein popoles benefesh. And it says
what Russian?
Poelet, shehein poelet benefesh.
Yeah.
And it's a long halacha. How important it is to wise.
Interesting. I have to look it up to see. It probably can be applied here.
I was thinking, he says joy, worry, anger, and fright are psychological reactions, but they cause a physiological change in the body.
Well, he said that here before, that you could have so-called spirit, psychic pain or a pleasure or pain, and it affects the body. Yeah. I mean, we know that. We see that. Look, anyone that's had a real simcha, we know simcha is not just in your soul and heart. Your whole body, your whole being is. Even we know it also heals people. There's a healing agent in it too.
And it says even that we shouldn't be overstimulated in happiness, because in eating and drinking, as the fools do, for the reason that too much joy and warmth of the heart is diffused over the entire body, and the natural warmth of the heart is cooled off, with the result that it may actually cause.
What is the context? What halacha is that? What's the simon?
It's talking about health
Tefillah?
of the, talking about like the Rambam Hilchos Daas, that we have to.
Okay. Just in general
about
behavior.
Shmiras Haguf. Shmiras Haguf.
I got it. What simon is it again? What simon and sif?
Lev, chapter 32 in
Orach Chaim?
No, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Kitzur. You're looking at Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Okay.
I don't think he brings it over there. Rules concerning physical well-being. Shmiras Haguf ala Pita.
So it's probably from
Rambam. The Rambam.
The Rambam, but also Shulchan Aruch has a section on that in another area. Yeah, I'll look it up.
It's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. And the grief, it talks about grief, how diet can cause the reverse joy can also close off the body, and how it affects the heart, and it can cause.
Okay, so it's a support to what it says here. Good. Okay.
I'm having a little difficulty understanding whether this is a mashal or whether this is an exact example of what his point is, because let's say he talks about someone's involved making some effort. He says here, like thinking, and that he may prevent him from feeling some pain in his body. I mean, it's koach hanefesh, so it's just the physical vitality of the body. There's not really anything spiritual, so that's not the problem. But my question is, if the blood, if the ruchnias shebegashmis is if that level of ruchnias is vivifying the body, it vivifies the body throughout evenly. And so is he saying here that because your animalistic vitality is focused on one thing, so somehow you don't have a consciousness of animist, or somehow your animalistic vitality is different?
Why are you using the word animalistic? Why are you using animalistic for what?
Because it's well, okay, because I'm trying to relate to this at some level of the soul, and it's the lowest level. It's nefesh. It's niranan. It's nefesh, ruach, neshama. So it's the lowest level.
I think you're overthinking it a bit. It's very practical. It's about the person. We're not talking about the blood is running in a person, even if they're asleep, even if they're distracted, even the Majid Rebbe is singing a song, or a person is involved in his mind. The blood continues to run. He's pointing out that a human being, because he's busy and exerting himself and is consumed with or captivated by his thoughts, so therefore he's in a state where it explains this level where the spirit is less connected and less experiencing pain. That doesn't take away from the fact that there's life running through his bloodstream and giving him life. He's talking about the person is not state. He's giving yesh lekad. If he wants to explain, remember, at the end of the day, this is not a book on anatomy, and it's not a book on medicine or science. He's coming to explain the relationship between God and existence. And he's saying that there's a level where the soul engages with the body, the gashmis shabaruchnis, the ruchnis shabagashmis. And yet there's also a level that is not affected. So that level, the lower level, is affected by life experiences, or the bodily experience, I should say. The pain and joy, or the joy and pain of the body, bodily joy and pain, and vice versa. Then there's a state, a consciousness, if you want. Not talking here even in Avodah. He said seichel. It could be you're immersed in mathematical ideas. You could be immersed in something. You know, there are people, lahavdil, you could be watching a movie, and you're so taken by the movie, you don't even feel something you would feel if you were not so captivated.
Engrossed. Yeah.
Lahavdil. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying he's using something inappropriate thing, but I mean to say, so here the point is giving an example, or you could say a state where a person is in a state where nefesh is being less affected by the life, by the physicality. You know, you see this also if people are very concentrated on something, they will be less affected. They don't have to yawn, or they won't sneeze, or they won't have to go to the bathroom. There's a certain, the bodily, the regular bodily comings and goings, so to speak, are less impactful when that person is in that state. So he's talking here far more of a state of consciousness than anything technical, really. It's not, he didn't say there's no pain. He says you just don't feel it.
So it's a subtle point. He's saying that this reflexive interaction between body and soul, if you will, is a very subtle one. It's a very light one that can be sort of disconnected, at least, as it were,
well, in some instances, look, as I said, if the pain is very intense,
of course,
then so debilitating, then it's going to be very difficult to get into a place like that.
But it's like it's a thin connection. I mean, obviously the life force, the vitality. Yeah.
I'll give an example. Lawrence Taylor, the New York Giants linebacker, was known to play football even when he was very seriously injured. So they asked him, how do you do it? So he said, it's mind over matter. When you don't mind, it doesn't matter. Meaning that sometimes when you're really concentrated on something, you could ignore and a pain that another person may not be able to ignore because you really very concentrated to get the job done, and certain things are going to bother. I mean, I'm just throwing out more examples. But that's really the point here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, the flow that goes here, he gives yesh lekar of zeis from the tir des seichel, and then he says hari b'shosh hanefesh l'mal mistav ein margish. So he's giving it's a type of example, but also something we all have in our human experience. We have this type of thing. Yeah. Look, I often use an example, not this exactly, but some things that bother one person doesn't bother a person who's in a higher state of consciousness, if you wish. If a little child came over to you right now and started kicking you and scratching you, most likely you're not going to get down on your hands and knees and start kicking back. It's a child. It's not going to bother you. You're not in that place. So when an adult would come over and insult you or say something derogatory, then more likely you're going to be insulted and affected. In other words, the effect of things on us is very much where we are. You have people, for example, that are in a very different place. You can't say much that's going to so-called hurt them because they're not because they're not sensitive, because their mind is they don't allow petty things to bother them. I mean, I'm not saying now in the context of physical pain or pleasure, I'm speaking more psychologically. So the similar idea that you can be in a state where every little detail makes you crazy. Another person gets to a point, you know what? The details don't matter. He's involved in bigger things and so on. So he not impacted quite the same way. I'm just broadening it a bit. That's not what the Rebbe Rashab says, obviously. Just wanted to somewhat broaden the comment. Okay. Any other questions? Let's read the next half of this parentheses. She says, like, the Chaim move on. Bring another example here, another scenario. The Chaim move on mizeh, and the same idea is also understood from another scenario. She'ispilus hamidah shebelev ma'asogus hasechel. He's giving you that the excitement, the stimulation, or the arousal of midah shebelev ma'asogus hasechel, like we learned earlier, that when a person, the mind comprehends something, and in turn it stimulates and causes spilus hamidus, al yedei hadas dafke. That the dynamic happens through das. Shehu das hamispashet hamevi umamshech lamata lispol ba'amida. I'll explain, but let me read inside for translate first. This is the das that extends, that carries umamshech and draws draws oisei lamata, takes the seichel, the chochma and the bina, lispol ba'amida. They should be excited, should be stimulated or aroused in the midah. V'lula hiskashus she'edei hadas, and if you do not have that bonding, that concentration, that through das, harilo yispol b'zeh, the person would not, the emotion would not get stimulated, kameshikosa b'mokimachet. Like it says elsewhere, and I think immediately what comes to mind is chapter 3 in Tanya. So let's explain what he just said, and then we'll bring it back to what he wants to explain here in this context here. So here's what he says in Tanya. He says, Chochma Bina is Abba ve'ima, father and mother. Chochma is the spark of an idea. You conceive of something. Bina is the mother, like the womb, that develops the idea, fleshes it out. So now you have a full-blown understanding of something. Even, let's say, an understanding of Hashem Echad. Or there he talks about the understanding of Seva Mamala Kalam, Seva Kalam, Kula Kamei Kala Chashiv. But you have an understanding. However, there's still one more stage. You wanted to give birth. You wanted to give birth to feelings, to a sense of love and attraction, and a sense of reverence. Yira, Av and Yira, Tasha. Av and Yira are like the children of the Seichel, the Midas. So you can have a father and mother that have a great relationship, but if they're not going to be intimate, you're not going to have a birthing. You'll have great ideas, but you're not going to have a birthing. So he says that explicitly. He says, so Das is this kashus, the intimate connection between the two, and intimate connection with the idea. That's why it says Adam Yoda as Chava, that Adam knew Chava. And what is Yoda? Intimacy. And without the intimacy, it says it will not really be the birth of Midas. It'll be more demyanus. He calls it more like delusional or illusions. So real birthing is dependent not just on a great understanding of the idea, but that you feel it's there for you. There's an intimate connection, somewhat like we learned earlier when we spoke about Midas. It's not just your mind understands, because it's an excitement in your mind. It's an intellectual excitement. But you have not come to the conclusion that it's good for you. Daas is the bridge between the idea and it's the kashus that creates an intimacy, and now it will give birth to Midas. That's what he says there. Now, of course, Das without Chochmah Bina doesn't do the job either, because you do have to have a concept and you have to have an understanding of it. So you need both, like we learned earlier as well. So he's bringing this as an example here as well. What's the example now? So the last lines in the parentheses. What do we understand from this Das, the role of Das? The Ispilus HaNefesh, Memikri Aguf, that the Ispilus HaNefesh, the effect, the impact of the Nefesh from the bodily experiences, Hurak Beruchnis HaNefesh, HaMislabish Ba'adam, Loi Be'etzem HaRuchni Shel HaNefesh. It's only in the spirit of the Nefesh that manifests in the blood, not in the Etzem Ruchni of the Nefesh, not in the core Ruchni of the Nefesh, as we learned the higher level, the Ruchnius Sheba Ruchnius, so to speak, instead of the Ruchnius Sheba Gashmius or the Gashmius Sheba Ruchnius that goes into the Ruchnius Sheba Gashmius. That's what we come away with from the Das. Now, the question is, what does he mean by this? So, in other words, you see from this, the Spilus, my understanding of it, at least initially, is like this, that his Spilus requires another step. You can have something intact, but that's not going to necessarily stimulate or arouse something, like it is with Chachma and Bina without Das. So the fact that something gets mispol from something impacts something, requires another step. So he's using Das as an example. Just like Das is that extra step that will create a stimulation and arousal of Midas, so too, the Nefesh has to come down a level to be able to experience the mispal, the mikri haguf, from the life, from the bodily experiences. And if it does not, the etzem haruchni shel nefesh, it doesn't experience that. Now, the question is, how does the Das help us understand it? It's an example. I get the comparison, but what is the example helping Yesh Lekarev? How is this helping us understand the idea better with Das? It's definitely a good example. Maybe what he's trying to say is trying to understand how Seichel, without Seichel on its own, does not have Hispilus Hamidis. So the Ruchni of the Nefesh, without it coming into the Dam, which is like Das, Skashus to the body, is not going to be affected. I need to give it some more thought. But that's what he says. I'm happy to hear if anybody wants to comment on this.
Maybe he's saying that even when there is this Das, which is, that gives birth to emotions, which is, a fairly meaty, substantial process or seeming manifestation of if you will, the Ruchnius Shebagashmius, that nevertheless, it will not touch the Ruchnius Shebaruchnius. So no matter how intense you may be feeling something, it can't affect. It's an Indian of Lo Shanisi. It can't affect the Ruchnius Be'etzem. So he's saying, it only, this level of interaction between body and soul, if you will, only goes so far. It's there, it's reflexive, but it only goes so far. That's how I read it.
Yeah, but how do you see that in Das? That the intellect of the person is not affected by the fact that it gave birth to emotions? How does that work in Das? I understand Das brings the excitement, the Das stimulates and gets the midas going. But where in the nimshal do you see, in the mashal do you see that the mind remains detached from the emotional experience? I don't think he wants to say that.
He's saying that he's spilus hanefesh. This level of activity or effect on the soul is rak baruchnish hanefesh hamislabeshes.
I know what he says. I know what he says. But how does the Das help us understand this better than what we? Let's say we didn't have the example of Das. What would be we're missing?
Well, I think
that was what
that,
the comparison is very clear. I didn't question the comparison. I was wondering what is it adding that we wouldn't know without the Das metaphor here, example. That's
perspective. I think the proper word for that in this person is perspective. If you have the right perspective, then it makes a difference whether you get involved or not, or you get affected or not. That the interchangeable for that should be the word perspective, and that will explain it all.
What do you mean? I'm not sure. What do you mean by perspective here? Well, explain.
It's a perspective. Even when you talk about the guy that let's say did it without the anesthesia, he had a proper perspective of what's going on. You are where your mind is. I mean, we're told that. So it's all about perspective. So if you have the proper perspective, then you can be involved or detached or not involved.
Yeah, but that's the first half of the parentheses. That's the first half. That when his mind is involved, that's very clear. Is immersed in something, he won't feel the pain. But how does that apply? I'm talking about the second half. Talking about Das now. Das carries over the mind into a spilus in the left. Anyway, the comparison is clear. That's not my that's fine. This comparison
there are two sides of the same coin.
The question is, what is he adding with Das? And I hear what you guys are saying. Okay.
No, but one is a case where you don't feel that he's spilus, and the other is a case where you feel it with intensity, but it still doesn't touch the ruchnius shabaruchnius.
I don't know where do you see that in Das? Where does it not touch the mind? Because the heart gets stimulated with love, the mind is detached from that. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that even with intense feelings that are going to affect the nefesh. Let's take a simcha let's say like a chasen or something. Your child gets married.
But where's Das? That we know that before we learned the example of Das. What you just said, he said earlier. He said it very clearly that that it does not affect the deeper, the ruchnis shabaruchnis is not affected by the pain or the pleasure of the body. That's clear. I got that. That's not a question. How does Das help us understand that? That's my question here. But okay.
I thought these were just examples to drive it home. Well, but maybe he's coming just to emphasize it, to explain it more clearly.
Okay, I'm asking. So the comparison I got, that's what we learned. I'm wondering, is there something that the first example actually does add? It gives us yesh l'karev. It explains experience that we all have, where you can be in a higher state of consciousness or concentration and you don't feel pain. Here, it's more of a comparison. It could be he's bringing it just for comparative purposes, no problem. I was wondering if there's more to it than just a comparison. That's all. No need to belabor it. I'll give it some more thought. Okay. So with that, he ends the first parentheses. And now there's another one, which we'll learn in the next class, obviously. Good. So unless there are more questions, we conclude here. We can conclude here. Okay, move them is okay.
Well, what I'm asking what your takeaway is. Well, I mean, let me ask you if my takeaway is a correct one here, that the interaction between the ruchnius and the goof that is a very ephemeral one. It's a very I'll say thin or delicate one, because yes, there's ruchnius shabagashmius, and there is a reflexive interaction between the two. But it's a very thin line. It's a very light one. And so maybe his
I know
point
the thin
is
line and light one doesn't frankly resonate with me. I'm not sure where you're
No?
getting that from here. He never used anything that's close to that expression. If it helps you understand it, maybe. I wouldn't personally use that expression that it's a light one. I would simply use it. There's two stages here. There's the stage of the etzem of the ruchnius that remains removed, so to speak. And there's the ruchnius that manifests within the blood, that engages and does feel the experiences of the body. So I don't know if I would call it a light one, but again, if it's something that helps you understand it, that's fine. But what you just said is exactly what he's saying here. I don't think it's you don't. I mean, it's not. I don't see you adding anything to what doesn't say here explicitly. It's exactly what he said, that there's two stages, and he says clearly that the nefesh itself, atzma, lo tispol klal, that the nefesh itself will not be affected at all from the pleasure and pain of the body. So yes, there are two. And if you're asking if there are two things here, yes, of course, that's exactly the theme here.
I'm just trying to think ahead to what I feel. I mean, that he's using this whole structure.
Well, I don't really think ahead, as you probably know. So
yeah, I know.
I'm not as quick as you.
I'm sure you're 10 times quicker, but you have a better focus.
No, because right now we're right here trying to understand exactly what he's saying, and he's going to come back, and let's see how far he comes back, and whatever he doesn't come back to, we can go to Mittler Rebbe and so on.
Well, I'm just trying to fit it into the picture of how we can use our nefesh, our neshama, our spiritual capacities to engage the nefesh habahamis so that it can transform.
I understand, but my training is that I want to finish the Rebbe finish everything he has to say before I would go there.
Sometimes, if you see A and Z, you can figure out what the F, E, F, G are. Sometimes that's all I'm saying.
Well, in my experience, I find it much more that will ultimately be more understandable once we see the whole topic. And we don't have. He's not finished it yet, so my mind is not even thinking at all where you're at. So,
okay.
I know the point of departure. We know the point of departure very clearly. He's coming to explain Hashem Echad, the Leisha Nisi of Yesh Ma'ayin. That's very clear. And now he's using the Neshama and Guf to help us understand that. So I understand the contemplation. And I think there's more to come that will help us a lot in understanding how to translate it into Nefesh Elikis Nefesh Abamis language. But I understand. See, I'm trying to understand what this parenthesis is saying right now. And that's why, for me, if I start thinking about where this is going to, then I never understand this exact text here. Now, it's possible when we learn later, it'll come back to help us understand what we learn now too. Absolutely. Maybe he's going to refer to Daas again later. And maybe we'll understand it. So I'm not denying that that's possible. Okay, good. So we finished the parentheses, top of page, first third of page 1469.